So, a very good morning, afternoon, evening to each one of us who would be listening to this presentation. So, the title of my presentation is On the Fringes of Citizenship, the Making of Foreigners from Citizens in India's National Register of Citizens. Now, before I begin, I would quickly like to share the research design. Uh, the research question that I have attempted to answer through my presentation is: how has the National Register of Citizens in Assam and the process of making foreigners from citizens in Assam created a crisis in the state? Now, in doing so, the methodology that I have applied is semi-structured interviews of people, whereby I have interviewed more than 60 people in Assam who have been excluded from the National Register of Citizens list, besides a discourse analysis of government speeches and media reports on the issue. Now, so to quickly begin with, what exactly is the NRC, and just a uh, background to what has led to the NRC. Now, the state of Assam in the northeastern corner of India has been a site of human movement since the colonial era, fostered by colonial administrators to suit their administrative as well as revenue related interest, primarily because of the presence of tea industry in the state that required large labor force for cultivation. Now, however, the post-colonial era saw the rise and growing fear and anxieties amongst the local population in Assam regarding the presence of illegal migrants as a threat to their identity and culture, and hence the demand for a national register of citizens was conceived. So basically, it's a bureaucratic exercise transformed as a citizenship litmus test in the state to sift the illegal immigrants from the valid and genuine citizens through the production of documentary evidence dating back to several decades. Now, the Supreme Court put out a list of admissible documents issued up to the midnight of 24th of March 1971 that one must be in possession of in order that one is rendered eligible for being included in the updated NRC. Now, this date basically marks the beginning of the genocide perpetrated by the Pakistani forces in East Pakistan till Bangladesh was liberated in December 1971. Now, the NRC of 1951 basically remained the basis, while the electoral rolls up to 1971 and in their absence certain other documents issued up to the midnight of 24th of March 1971 were listed as admissible. Now, while these were described as legacy documents, the Apex Court also released another set of documents that would be considered admissible if one was to prove one's linkage with the persons in possession with the legacy documents. In case one is born after 24th March 1971, and in case one is required to substantiate one's claims to citizenship in India. Now, the second set of documents was being labeled as linkage documents, which I'll be sharing in the next slides. However, one of the major exceptions within the Citizenship Act is the idea of legacy data, by which an Indian citizen cannot be eligible to be included in the NRC Assam unless and until he or she has a pre-1971 legacy in the state. So my birth will not be enough to prove my citizenship. I will have to show that my ancestors have migrated to Assam on or before 1971. Now, so for one thing, the NRC preparation in Assam basically reflected the anxiety on the state's part to establish what may be called a paper world in which one's existence as a citizen is made to rest with one's ability to prove it with a trail of documents to be determined from time to time by competent authorities, while one's physical existence became irrelevant. Now, one can only decipher what C.B. Macpherson calls a proprietor of one's capacity and person. And if and only if one has the possession of the papers that attest to this proprietorship, one can call himself or herself as an eligible citizen under the NRC process. Now, the mediation of law in the proprietorship becomes very, very important here. Now, citizenship is thus situated within the current context in a Kafkaesque world in which paper trial precedes, if not overshadows, the existence. Now, the NRC list, the final NRC list was basically released on August 31, 2019, whereby 1.9 million people were left out and they overnight turned suspect citizens, and their citizenship was effectively called into question. leaving them in a state of limbo, and they have been pushed to a subhuman level, or as Agamben notes, bare life, putting them at a risk of becoming stateless. Now, the process has resulted in the loss of lives of hundreds of citizens over the anxiety over losing the citizenship status. Now, unclear of what lay ahead of for the excluded, I mean, as there has not been any final verdict on the part of the government as to what would ultimately happen to the people whose names would not come up on the list. Many people, as I have mentioned, basically committed suicides, and they were pushed to a situation of anxiety, and they were pushed to a situation of complete loneliness. Now, what makes the NRC process all the more complicated is that the onus basically shifted on the citizen and not the state to prove their citizenship, which is what has created what I call the crisis in the state of Assam with regards to citizenship. Now, here are the list of documents that were needed to prove citizenship under the NRC. Now, there were two lists, List A and the next slide will show List B. Now, List A are basically documents which were issued before the midnight of 24th of March 1971, where the name of self or the ancestor of the applicant would appear to prove that he or she resided in Assam up to the midnight of 24th of March 1971. So the documents are 1951 NRC or electoral rolls, land and tenancy records, citizenship certificates, permanent residential certificate, refugee registration certificate, passport, LIC, or any other government issued documents. Now, in the list B is basically linkage documents. So if any of the documents of list A does not belong to the applicant himself or herself, but to the applicant's ancestor, like for example, the mother or father or grandfather or the great grandfather or grandmother of the applicant, in such cases, the applicants would have to submit documents or the list B documents, which are also known as linkage documents, to show his or her relationship with the ancestors, that is either mother, father, grandfather, grandmother, etc., whose names basically appear on list A. Now, such documents will have to be legally acceptable documents which clearly prove such relationship. So, in under list B documents, the documents which were admissible were birth certificate, land documents, board or university certificates, ration card, electoral rolls, bank or life insurance corporation or post office records. Now, here I move on to the fear of the migrant. Now, uh, the reason why the NRC was implemented in Assam was that there were proclamations from various quarters since time immemorial, that basically created a fear of migrant within the Assamese consciousness or the consciousness of the state of Assam. Now here, as we can see, probably, I mean, this is a report or statement by Mr. S. C. Mulan, who was the census superintendent of Assam during the colonial rule of Assam. And he wrote in 1931 that probably the most important event in the province during the last 25 years, an event moreover which seems likely to alter permanently the whole feature of Assam and to destroy the whole structure of Assamese society and civilization, has been the invasion of a vast horde of land-hungry immigrants, mostly Muslims from the districts of East Bengal. Wheresoever the carcass, there are the vultures will gather there. The only thing I can compare it to is the mass movement of a large body of ants. Here we can see how the migrants have been dehumanized through ants and vulture. Now again in 1998, Lieutenant General S.K. Sinha, who was also the governor of Assam, basically sent a letter to the President of India stating that a large-scale illegal migration from East Pakistan or Bangladesh over the several decades has been altering the demographic complexion of the state now, and it poses a grave threat to both the identity of the Assamese people and our national security. And it is important that the governments at the center and the state meet this challenge. Now, here, this is something that I call the paradox of globalization, because with globalization, we see that borders are opening up. People are coming more and more closer to each other. I mean, the world has now become a global village. But, I mean, the fear of the migrant basically reminds us of Benedict Anderson's specter of comparison, in which he points out how the forces and processes of globalization have not only accentuated, have only accentuated the fears and anxieties of losing one's identity in an increasingly globalized world. world. So this is what I call the paradox of globalization, where on one hand we are moving towards a global village where we are coming together, and borders and boundaries are kind of becoming dissolved, and at the same time we are extremely fearful and anxious about losing our identity in a world which is largely globalized, and there's people from all walks of life, from across the borders and boundaries coming in together. Now, the alarmist literature on the Assam situation basically draws our attention to the history of almost incessant influx, mostly though not exclusively, of Bengali speaking migrants from outside Assam, slowly assuming intractable proportions over the years, and how it basically threatens to establish the rule of foreigners in many of the electoral constituencies of Assam. It causes the alienation of land hitherto owned by natives. It basically cuts into the employment opportunities, and it jeopardizes the language and culture of native Assamese population. And how there is a glaring problem that Assam would be turning into greater Bangladesh sooner or later. Now, thus, because of all of these allegations, NRC was projected as an essential tool to get rid of the unwanted in Assam, and this is how the policy was seen as being acceptable and mainstreamed across the political spectrum. However, what happened in the NRC is basically an unending story of loss, death, and despair. Now, this part for this part of the discussion, I shall primarily be kind of relying on using the victims' perspectives and replies, and it would rely on the victims' account of exclusion and their perception of the structures of exclusion that have created the crisis in the state of Assam. Now, it basically I'll basically go on to uncover the variegated accounts of strife, trauma, devastating trails of loss and sufferings experienced by the people on the edge under the NRC. Now, the other lives, who are mostly the ones who belong to the margins of the state, the poor, the illiterate, who couldn't gather the documents required, and who have been excluded from the list, and for whom the intricacies of the exercise proved extremely difficult. Now, more than 100 people in the state of Assam have lost their lives, and their deaths are basically connected to citizenship related issues. Now, while some have allegedly committed suicide due to the frustration, anxiety, and helplessness related to the National Register of Citizens, some allegedly took their lives fearing incarnation in the detention camps, and also because they were afraid as to how they would live without citizenship. Now, the victims basically suffered from paradigmatic existential crisis. They were totally helpless, and they were abandoned to a chilling future, as the state has basically rendered its own citizens stateless after they have lived long in a country. Now, the anxiety, social pain, and mass distress inflicted upon the anxious citizens, and the fear of being misclassified, tens and thousands of people, including the illiterate, they have basically been running from pillar to post. To get hold of the documents, or even damaged documents, to just prove their identity. Now, the crisis was also created because there was an unfair burden on the poor from selling off their livestock to mortgaging their lands, and in the process, besides spending on an average of 140 to 70 US dollars to legally defend their claims to citizenship. So they were under immense pressure just to prove their citizenship. Now, this is a narrative that I have shared, and this was shared to me in course of my interview with a victim who recently lost his, who basically lost his wife and youngest son. Both of them went missing. So I'll just read out. So, my wife was suffering from immense stress after the publication of the NRC list, which did not have her name and the name of my youngest son. My wife did not have any supporting documents to establish her linkage with her parents. She basically faced social exclusions around people, as people around us used to call her Bangladeshi infiltrator and used to ask her where her home was in Bangladesh. They used to scare her by saying that the police would come and take her away and her son away. My 7-year-old son often used to wake up in the middle of the night, shivering and crying, asking whether he will be put in a jail. Unable to cope up with the stress, she went missing with my son. Our family is torn apart now. Will I ever be able to find my wife and son? Will our lives be normal again? Now, this is yet another narrative of a person who had migrated from Bangladesh to Assam when he was only 7 years old, and the person is now 70 years old, and after spending half of his life now in Assam, he now has to prove his citizenship. And he basically asked me, will they put me in a detention camp and deport me to Bangladesh? Will this suffering ever end? Now, this is one of the most chilling stories. The person you see here on screen is is a man of 102 years old, and he was basically put behind the bars after he was being declared a foreigner. So it was alleged that he was residing in India without any valid documents, and there were doubts raised about the nationality of the victim. However, he did. He did possess proof of his nationality, but since he could not attend the hearing, the foreigners tribunal hearing, where he had to defend his claim to citizenship, he was declared a foreigner and he was put behind the bars. And I mean, the victim, he was already suffering from age-related ailments, and his memory loss made him forget about the whereabouts of the documents. And the old and feeble man basically had to pass his days in extreme hardships in his 3-month-long stay in the detention camps. He had to go to the bathroom on his own, had to eat what was served by the jail, since the provision of allowing food to be given to the detainees by the families was not allowed. So now a man, thus at the fag end of his life, had to endure such inhuman mental and physical persecution only for the sake of proving his citizenship. Now his bail order was made, requesting the authorities to grant him bail because of his old age and ailments, including memory loss and hearing problems. Now, what has been the response and reaction of the government because of this crisis? Now, the ruling government, has regularly threatened that the people would be sent to Bangladesh, no humanitarian aid and assistance was provided to help the impoverished and the illiterate to prove their citizenship. Rather, the Union Home Minister of India basically called the illegal immigrants as infiltrators and termites, and also gave regular proclamations that they would be deported, and this perpetuated the anxieties of the victims. Now, the Indian government is also building mass detention camps to hold the stateless population after the exercise is concluded. Now, which also reminds us of the ghettos and concentration camps. However, Bangladesh government basically considers NRC as India's internal matter, or ruling out the possibility of deportation. Now, I would like to conclude by basically stating that the complex issue of human migration is beyond borders cannot be resolved by a list or a wall, and the Indian government basically needs to humanize the problem, and it is only possible through granting of amnesty to the NRC rejects, which is like the only human resolution of the citizenship imbroglio in Assam. Now citizenship, as we have seen, has been an instrument both of crafting a people of equals in which rights are universals and not a privilege, as well as dividing people into territorialized national policies, turning universal rights and belonging into privileges of membership in a polity. Now, on the one hand, citizens comprise a people united around a body of law and/or rights and a sense of narratives about its origins. On the other hand, it is also constituted in relation to those with limited or no rights and those remaining outside the narratives and people's community of origin. However, since it is citizenship basically is the pathway that enables people to have an access to all sorts of other rights, it is vitally important that one moves beyond a security-driven vision of cross-border human mobility to create a more human rights compliant focus, so that effects over individuals' well-being and lives are properly systematically prioritized over security policy consideration and interest. I would like to end my presentation here, and I look forward to your comments and feedback on my presentation. Thank you.